All right, Caitlin, you want to take it away?
Sure. Well, good evening, Leanne. I guess we're gonna have a small group tonight, and I have a feeling it's probably because a little bit everybody's occupied with floods and news and keeping up. But welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. I have Matt Shields with me today. He's our consultant that's been working on the community wildfire resiliency plans for us. He's going to run through a little bit about what the plans are all about, how wildfire resiliency works in a framework that the regional district can help, what kind of wildfire risk and threat look like in Electoral Area G. And then I'll go over some of the opportunities that might go into the plan as recommendations, and then we can have a bit of a chat at the end if you have any questions or want to learn more about what we've been chatting about. So Matt, I'll let you take it away.
If I could just interrupt for a little bit. I am the Area G director, and I widely shared the invite, but I'm wondering if you can tell me how many people may be registered or not, or anybody.
Yeah, so in total, we had 6 people register.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's including yourself.
Okay. And so, yeah, because as the director, I was just going to be a silent observer. I'm happy to receive the plan, but if there was some efficiency in gaining you your evening back, then I would be more than happy and willing to provide that opportunity. And just to put it in perspective, I have been on Zoom since 9 a.m. this morning.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
So
me too.
So if we wanted to wait just a couple minutes, and if nobody comes in, I'd be happy to view your presentation later, or maybe you, again, I'm not exactly sure, the content of your presentation. It would be good information for me to have for sure. I live in an area that's forested, so I'm personally interested, but I feel really selfish if I'm the only one here taking up all of your time. So I'll totally leave it up to you. I just wanted to provide that. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I know Matt and I had discussed doing a dry version, like a totally dry run version of the plan, just so that of the presentation, so we could post it later. But we also don't have to do that right now. So
if we go through it and I stay quiet, then you guys could get your pre-recorded thing done, and then I could share it with everybody.
Or we could pre-record like tomorrow and then just email it out to you.
So I don't want to stop this beautiful conversation, but we have one more guest in the waiting room. So maybe I might say tonight we should honor this person's time, unless they're
Agree.
Awesome.
Okay, so I'll just let Tim in here. Okay, and Caitlin, since you already gave me that lovely introduction, I'll just quickly recap here before we get started. Thanks for joining us, both Leanne and Tim. My name is Matt Shields. I work for a company called Diamond Head Consulting. I am a professional forester working for the Regional District of Nanaimo on preparing a new community wildfire resiliency plan for your electoral area. So I will just get started on my presentation here, and hopefully all will become clear as we roll through. So before I get going here, I just wanted to acknowledge that our project takes place on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Snuneymuxw, Snuneymuxw, Qualicum, and Relations. And I also wanted to mention that I am joining from the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh in Vancouver tonight. So tonight's agenda. So first, I'm going to give a brief refresher on what a community wildfire resiliency plan is, if you happen to miss our meeting in August, that is. Then secondly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we found on wildfire risk in your community. And then the third part of the presentation is I'll be talking about how the community wildfire resiliency plan can support FireSmart and wildfire prevention in your community, and what actions are likely to be the most important based on your context. And I'm thinking that the presentation in the past for other electoral areas, it's taken about 30 minutes. So we should be about that tonight as well. And then following the presentation, we'll have time for an open-ended Q&A. If you have any questions, suggestions, or thoughts, please feel free to share them then. Okay, so what is a community wildfire resiliency plan anyways? So a community wildfire resiliency plan is adopted by local government, in this case, the Regional District of Nanaimo, and it maps wildfire risk around communities and promotes recommendations to reduce that risk. And these plans are paid for through grants offered by the provincial government. And what you get at the end is a high-level strategy for managing wildfire risk in your community. It looks something like this. These are excerpts from a community wildfire plan that my company recently prepared for the Sunshine Coast Regional District. The plans are meant to be read by the public as well as policymakers and are going to place wildfire risk in your area in the context of your local landscape, community values, and historic ignitions. The recommendations that are included in the plan provide strategic advice on how the Regional District of Nanaimo can manage that wildfire risk. And as I mentioned in the third part of this presentation, we'll be talking about some of the recommendations and the kind of recommendations that the plan will make. But before we get off the ground here, I just want to go over one point, and that's that I think, or you should think of the plan as a first step towards building a FireSmart community. So the plan will leave lots of room for the Regional District of Nanaimo to tailor risk management to local circumstances and interests. And it also acts as a key to more provincial funding for fire risk management. Okay, so our process. So to make one of these documents, it starts with a review of your community's context, including the weather and climate, fire history, the environment and environmental values, and also cultural values. Then we make site visits to public parks and other public lands to assess potential wildfire behavior, validate provincial data, and look at public infrastructure. The third component is analysis. So we take some of the data we collect to conduct a mapping exercise where we model wildfire risk on public lands. And then lastly, we make those recommendations. So we're at the point where we're still developing recommendations, as I mentioned, which is why your participation in the Q&A is very important tonight. Okay. So let's talk about some of the background material for the plan. So we don't have time to go through all of the material, but it includes population and area statistics, growth trends, parks, environment and natural landscape info, climate and weather, as I discussed, including climate change. But first and foremost, it recognizes that Electoral Area G is a community by the sea. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but it did. So there's, oops. There is something else that each of our communities share. And Leanne, you pointed out when we were just chatting earlier that this is our community's proximity to forests. So almost all of us within the electoral area live within an area called the wildland urban interface, which is that area outlined in orange. And as you can see, that orange area is more or less the entire electoral area G. So this is an area determined by the province that forms a buffer around areas of higher population density. And it's very important for managing wildfire risk because, firstly, it's where most people live and most infrastructure is located. Secondly, it's where homes directly meet forests and forest vegetation. And thirdly, it's where there are the most sources of ignition for potential wildfires. So a second piece of background that I want to bring up is historic wildfires in your area. So we know that fire is part of the ecological history of most coniferous forests in North America. That's true of our area as well. Before colonial settlement, large natural fires may have occurred as frequently as once every 150 to 200 years. Fire was also used extensively by Indigenous people along the coast. Pre-colonial fire history is an area of active research. And for our project, we looked more closely at data maintained by the BC Wildfire Service and also listened to locals who told us where fires have occurred. So this map is showing two pieces of data from the BC Wildfire Service. And the first is polygons or shapes. You can see those sort of blobby pink areas. These represent larger fires in the province's database. These are typically larger than 1 hectare in size, or 100 meters by 100 meters. These records are kept from 1919 to 2020, so 100 years. And every fire in this data set in our area occurred before 1940, except for 2 quite small fires in 2009. There were 26 larger fires in total between 1919 and 1940, and almost all of these would have been caused by land clearing for agriculture or forestry activities. So the second piece of data that you see on the map are those red dots. And the red dots are showing the province's data on smaller fire starts between 1950 and 2020. So these are places where a fire occurred, but it didn't grow to become one of those larger polygons. So there were 153 fire starts reported to the BC Wildfire Service during the time period, that's 70 years, but after 1950. And of these, 82 spread to surrounding vegetation in the forest and had to be actively fought. So there have been around 10 fire starts per decade in our communities for most of the past 70 years. The 2000s were an exception to this, seeing higher fire numbers, and we had 23 during that decade. So just to draw some points out of this map for you. So what you can see is that almost all the large wildfires occurred before 1950. And ignitions in recent decades are mostly small fires that were quickly suppressed or burned out due to unfavorable conditions. And these are indications that local firefighters are doing a good job of fire suppression, as well as advocating for fire safety. Additionally, I know that human-caused ignitions is a significant concern in your community, and that is borne out by the statistics. So 88% of the fires that are in the data set can be attributed to human causes, and less than 1% can be attributed to natural causes like lightning. And of course, some fires are of unknown cause, which is the remainder. And locals have told us that there are a variety of concerns, including illegal campfires and unattended fires on rural property. Okay. So another piece of the background info, climate change. As we know, global greenhouse gas emissions are causing changes in the Earth's atmosphere. And around Western North America, research has shown an increasing fire season length on average. In our region, observed and predicted climate change shows that we may have hotter, drier weather in the summer and for a longer part of the year. And rainfall is predicted to increase in winter, spring, and fall. It may increase slightly in summer, but likely not enough to offset the effect of warmer temperatures. So on the balance, these changes are thought likely to support increased wildfire activity. However, in a particular fire year, excuse me, fire potential is strongly influenced by the weather we receive and experience. So it can be difficult for models of climate change to predict what fire behavior will be. In particular, precipitation volumes and distribution have large effects on fire season weather, and these outputs are some of the least certain from standard climate models. So another piece of information about climate change we can consider is what happened in the past. And we know that our region has had warm and cold periods since the end of the last ice age. And during warm periods, charcoal records show that fire was a more regular occurrence than it is now. Overall, we should acknowledge that risk may increase over time because of climate change. And this is one reason that community wildfire planning is a cyclical process meant to be repeated as communities and forests change. And the last piece of background that I want to address before we talk about wildfire risk analysis is land ownership in our community. So this map is showing you everywhere that's private land. The blacked out areas on the map are that private land. And as you can see, the majority of our community is privately owned, and most public land is discontinuous. So under the terms of our project's funding, we can't assess wildfire threat on private land because of privacy concerns. And during our site visits, we look only at public land. So in the next section of the presentation, I'm only going to be showing and talking about wildfire risk on public land. But because we know much of the private land on the island is forested, it's important to recognize that wildfire risk doesn't stop at a parcel boundary. The abundance of private land in our community affects how we should respond to wildfire risk. So our site visits had a couple of purposes. And the first was to visit forests in the vicinity of homes and communities to make wildfire threat assessments. And we'll be talking about this process in detail in just a second. The second was to visit pieces of infrastructure that could be important for emergency response, like fire halls, water infrastructure, communications towers, or for example, the French Creek Pollution Control Center. And the third was to see a wide variety of areas to understand the form of development in different neighborhoods. So let's talk a little bit more about the wildfire threat assessments. So that wildfire threat assessment process, this is the backbone of the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan. And it relates to the mapping that we do based on our fieldwork in July and August. So the wildfire threat in wildfire threat assessments refers to the potential of a forest to ignite and support fire. Wildfire threat combines three elements. The first is forest fuels, more on that in just a second. The second is weather during the fire season. And the third is topography. Wildfire threat is rated for different forests on a scale between very low and extreme. And you can think of it as being somewhat like a rating of flammability. The threat ratings don't specifically take into account the likelihood of ignition. All forests from low to extreme require a spark before they burn. Okay, so the relationship between topography, weather, and fire is fairly straightforward. Steeper forested slopes allow for more rapid fire spread and intense fire behavior because of the simple fact that hot air rises. Fire at the bottom of a slope is preheating the forest above it, evaporating moisture from the forest and licking further up into tree crowns as it gets a leg up from the slope. For weather, the longer a hot, dry period, the easier it is for a fire to start because more and more of the forest moisture will have evaporated. Winds also stoke fire like a bellows and can lead to rapid fire growth. So the best weather conditions for a fire to start and grow are on a breezy day at the end of a long, hot drought. Forest fuels, on the other hand, are a bit more complicated in their relationship to fire behavior. So when we talk about forest fuels, we're simply talking about the wood, the branches, leaves, needles, shrubs, herbs, even organic soils, and other growing things, the biomass that can catch on fire and burn. So there are several traits that we use to characterize forest fuels, and don't worry about writing these down. When making our threat assessments, we look at all of these common terms in our forest fuels glossary. So these traits tend to vary at the scale of a forest stand, which is an area of similar forest, usually sharing a common origin, such as a wildfire or a windstorm. Concepts like surface fuel, ladder fuel, and crown fuel describe the different parts of a forest and their role during a wildfire, while fuel stratigap and crown closure tell us how apart these pieces are. Measures of density, like stems per hectare, can be used to assess overall fuel volumes of living dead or even fallen trees. And tree species also influence fuel characteristics because coniferous trees are broadly more active during wildfire than deciduous. But the most important concept in our glossary to understand is that last one, the fuel type. So fuel types represent common patterns that we see in the other forest fuel characteristics. So every forest in Canada can be described as one of 16 fuel types developed by the Canadian Forest Service. And in BC, the BC Wildfire Service has adapted this system to describe our great diversity of forests. To help you make it through Fuel Types 101, I'm just going to provide 3 notes. The first is that coniferous trees and forests are more flammable than deciduous. The second is that for conifers, denser forests are usually more flammable than less dense forests. And the third is that forests with a lot of small young trees are usually more flammable than forests with a lot of big old ones. These rules are not absolute, but they give you the basics you need to start looking at forests and fire behavior around your community. Okay, so this map is showing you the common fuel types in Electoral Area G, on public land, of course. We have several. On this map, the orange colors are showing areas of coniferous-dominated forest, forests of Douglas fir, western red cedar, pine, and other species. And of those coniferous forests, a fuel type called the C5, shown in peachy orange, is the most common. And this fuel type represents forests of moderate density, mostly made up of middle to old aged trees, particularly Douglas fir. And they're typically associated with moderate wildfire threat. So next, areas shown in light pink and magenta. These represent a mix of forests all containing at least 25% deciduous trees. These mixed or pure deciduous forests are often held to have reduced wildfire threat because of the lower number of conifers. And then lastly, other colors scattered across the map are mostly non-forested areas like grassy areas at the foreshore. So just now in the discussion of fuel types, you heard me use the word typically. And this is because variability within the forest fuel types, topography, and the effects of weather all combine to make wildfire threat. Wildfire threat, as you'll recall, is a kind of probability that tells us how severe a fire could be under typical fire season weather conditions. So to help us think through all this stuff, fire rank is a visual classification used by the BC Wildfire Service to help illustrate the kinds of fire that can occur. And the higher the fire rank, the less predictable, faster spreading, and more dangerous the wildfire. Beyond rank 3, fires are often too difficult to directly fight with ground crews and must be extinguished by air support or favorable weather. And the important part here is that the likelihood of higher rank fires tends to increase with more flammable fuel types and more extreme fire weather. And one way of thinking about this is that it is easier, so to speak, for an area of high or extreme wildfire threat to sustain a fire of higher rank than for a moderate threat area. And lastly, one point on it I wanted to make on this slide is that those crown fires are wildfires where the fire is burning into the crown fuels, so the needles and branches in the upper part of the tree. And these fires can send off large numbers of embers, burn with high intensity, and are major threats to nearby communities. Of course, fire of any rank in the interface is capable of threatening homes and public safety if not controlled. So to put it together, the wildland-urban interface is where wildfire threat becomes wildfire risk. Risk is when there is something of value that could burn down because of a wildfire. So how specifically does wildfire threat become fire risk? So fires have 3 ways of spreading from forests into communities. The first is direct flame. This is when your home is exposed to wildfire by the ignition of its landscaping, yard debris, or other things that you have stacked up around the building. The second is radiant heat. What you need to know about this is that a fire front can generate a lot of energy. And if your home is within 10 to 30 meters of a forest on fire, the heat from the blaze can be enough to cause materials on your home to ignite. The greatest risk of this happening is within 10 meters. And thirdly, there's ember ignition. So a fire can send off embers or firebrands that ignite flammable materials well in advance of its arrival. So embers can lodge in crevices in your roof or siding or ignite landscaping near your home. And while embers can travel up to several kilometers ahead of a fire, the greatest risk is within a few hundred meters of a burning forest. So when fires with higher threat ratings occur within a few hundred meters of homes, we recognize higher wildfire risk. So we combined weather, fuels, and topographic information with data on the location of homes in the interface of Electoral Area G to come up with a new map of wildfire threat and risk. So on this map, wildfire threat ratings are indicated by the different colors. The blacked out areas are private land. You see most of the area is occupied by moderate risk. That's sort of the neon yellow color. There are a few smaller areas of low risk. That's the lighter yellow, and a few smaller areas of high, which is the orange. So we can see that moderate wildfire threat throughout most of the public lands, or there is moderate wildfire threat throughout most of the public lands in Electoral Area G, from Englishman River Park all the way west to Little Qualicum. And this is driven by the dominance of mature coniferous and mixed wood fuel types throughout this area and the generally subdued terrain. Those areas of low threat that you see on the map are typically pure deciduous forests. That small area of high threat forest near the boundary with Electoral Area H on the west side of Electoral Area G. This is an isolated area of younger, denser conifer forest. So even though private land severely fragments the land base, you can still get a sense of what wildfire risk looks like throughout the electoral area. And just to sort of summarize some of that material a bit more succinctly, moderate wildfire threat is typical on public lands. What does that mean? It means that many people live in areas where fire is possible during the typical fire season, even if a fire of higher rank is unlikely. The private land piece, what does that mean? Well, even though it's difficult to gain a complete picture of the risk environment, many private properties, of course, have forest cover. So we know that risk doesn't stop at a line on the map. And thirdly, high risk in your community is fairly isolated. The area of high wildfire threat in your community is quite small in comparison to other electoral areas, and it is also relatively far from densely populated areas. I just sort of wanted to sum up our little discussion of the risk analysis by bringing home the point that just because something is low risk doesn't mean that fire could never happen there. And likewise, just because an area is extreme risk or high risk, it doesn't mean that fire will definitely happen there. Fires require ignitions, favorable weather, and fuels. So risk reflects probability and not certainty. In the interface, almost everyone can benefit from thinking about FireSmart if they haven't already. Okay, so now that I have filled your head with all of that risk analysis, let's talk about what we could do to prepare. So the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan will make recommendations for the regional district to manage wildfire risk, and these recommendations will follow the 7 disciplines of FireSmart, which I've listed on the slide. So I've pulled out some of the high-level ideas that we are considering for the plans in Electoral Area G, and I've split them into education, community planning and development, emergency response, and fuel management topics, which we'll address on the following slides. And most of these actions will be eligible for additional provincial funding if supported by a community wildfire resiliency plan. So, education. Public education and outreach, of course, play a critical role in helping communities prepare for wildfire by promoting a sense of empowerment and shared responsibility. Recommendations in this section of the plan will focus on what the regional district can do to improve awareness of wildfire in the community and increase resources and participation in FireSmart by members of the public. So the plan will aim to align the regional district with good outreach and organizing around fire prevention that's already happening in your community. And for example, some actions might be to install wildfire awareness signage or educational material in popular park locations like trailheads in Englishman River and Top Bridge Regional Parks. Popular recreational areas are high traffic, high visibility locations where people are already going to think about forests. So this is a good opportunity to connect the dots between forests and fire. This can also look, this education piece, like increasing the awareness of FireSmart building and landscaping. So currently, Dashwood Fire Department has a FireSmart coordinator who liaises with community members in Dashwood about prevention and preparedness. And this person also conducts home assessments to help residents understand where the risk to their home comes from. So the regional district could investigate ways to provide a similar service for residents south and east of the Little Qualicum River, perhaps by coordinating a joint grant application for a new FireSmart coordinator role, likely to be shared with nearby Electoral Area F. Another way that the regional district could promote wildfire awareness is by organizing a community cleanup day for wildfire preparedness, typically focused on cleaning up of a smaller high-use park or public facility. These community preparedness days are great opportunities to demonstrate FireSmart landscaping principles to local residents who get hands-on experience in identifying and removing problem vegetation. Places like the River's Edge Community Trails, French Creek and Lee Community Parks, or Huckleberry Lane Community Park in Dashwood could be good locations to try events like this. So next up, community planning and development. Community planning and development recommendations address how the regional district conducts its own business, including park and infrastructure management. The regional district could initiate several changes to how communities are planned, ranging from making sure large development proposals are reviewed by local fire departments, to large public processes to revise the official community plan. A good place to start may be by ensuring that FireSmart information goes out with every development application. To begin to understand the risk on private land, the regional district could work to incorporate wildfire hazard assessments as required information for large development approvals in interface areas. And in the future, with public support, the regional district might be able to update subdivision and development rules so that FireSmart building is prioritized. The regional district may also be able to influence wildfire risk in your community through its park management. So the RDN could adopt internal policies to make sure parks, regional district property, and its own facilities are being constructed and maintained with FireSmart materials and landscaping, and to define a level of service in park management documents for wildfire hazard assessment. For new parkland or property acquisitions, the regional district can make sure that a wildfire hazard is assessed at or before the time of acquisition or leasing of new park properties. And the regional district can also access additional money to conduct FireSmart assessments of all of its critical infrastructure for emergency planning purposes. We've also heard that members in your community who want to FireSmart their properties are looking for a way to dispose of waste material, so the leftover brush that is removed from properties. And the regional district may be able to access additional funding for providing a dumpster or chipping services, or be able to waive tipping fees for this purpose. So the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan is likely going to recommend that staff develop a costed plan for waste disposal on a scheduled community chipping day or something like that. Next up, enhancing emergency response. So recommendations in this area will address how the regional district can integrate wildfire risk into its emergency planning and preparedness program. So the regional district can lead the update of emergency and evacuation plans, ensuring that each are adequate for community and neighborhood size. And internal policies can be developed to promote review of these plans when new large developments take place. The regional district can continue to liaise with local firefighters. During this project, we heard from firefighters that they are interested in seeing additional capacity for FireSmart education, as well as certain updates to our community planning processes that I've already mentioned on a past slide. Another thing the RDN can do is continue to advertise its local alert system, Voyant Alert, which is used to share emergency information with residents who have signed up. And lastly, another opportunity could be for the regional district to act as a common liaison between local fire departments, including Dashwood, Parksville, and Qualicum, the BC Wildfire Service, its own Parks Department, and possibly others, to host a regional meeting for joint training, such as a dry run through a wildfire scenario. Okay, so the last topic area addresses fuel management. So in some areas on public land, it may make sense to pursue fuel management. Fuel management, if you are not aware, is when a professional forester makes a detailed site assessment of fuel loading in an area and develops a prescription to reduce components of the forest that are creating risk. So these assessments are more detailed and intensive than the data we collected for the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan, and can be used to model wildfire behavior and intensity at specific sites. So the photos on the slide are showing you post-treatment condition in Douglas fir forest, similar to the forest found in our area. The point being that in most cases, the purpose of fuel management is to keep a forest in place, not to clear cut it. So the regional district is currently planning fuel management in the 707 Community Park on Gabriola Island, for example. In that location, high-density conifer forest is contributing to high wildfire threat near homes. And you can find out more about this and similar projects on the regional district's Get Involved page, where you registered for this event. The 707 Park Fuel Management Project will have another public event like this one, an online meeting, where you can learn more about this aspect of wildfire risk management and hear more about what it's all about. So for our purposes, it's critical to understand that fuel management typically targets smaller or dead trees, not large healthy ones, and that fuel management is a tool we can use in some situations to reduce the likelihood of fire spreading towards homes. So the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan is going to identify potential treatment areas on the basis of their wildfire risk rating, our site assessments, proximity to homes, and the availability of alternative measures to reduce wildfire risk. Given the moderate wildfire threat and limited public land base in Electoral Area G, we're not seeing fuel management as a high priority in any particular area, but there probably will be one or two areas that are identified as potential for future investigation. Okay, so while the planning process is ongoing, you can submit questions and find more information about our project at that Get Involved page for Wildfire Resiliency, and that's getinvolved.rdn.ca, and then search for wildfire. In the new year, we're going to be having another event to present highlights from each of the community wildfire resiliency plans for the 7 electoral areas before they go to the regional board. And this event will be online, similar to this one. And we're aiming to have the plan for Electoral Area G in place by February 2022, when it will go before the Regional District Board in a public meeting. So that brings me to the end of the presentation part of my event, or our event, excuse me. So now we have time to take questions. We were originally planning on having a larger audience tonight. So originally, I was going to ask you to use the raise hand feature, but with the small group we have tonight, I think we can just be casual. So if you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and just let us know what's on your mind. And we'll do our best to respond. Questions about wildfire risk and analysis and the CWRP, I should be able to answer for you. Questions more about emergency planning in general and RDN activities, Caitlin is your go-to person. But yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to pipe up and let us know.
Thank you, Matt and Caitlin. That had some really interesting slides, and I'm wondering if you could confirm if this presentation would be on the website, and so people could view the slides in more detail.
Yeah, so the presentation is being recorded. So at some point in the not too distant future, recording will be available on that Get Involved page for people to review. We haven't talked specifically about making the slide decks available, but if it was something that people are interested in, then I don't see why we couldn't put up a PDF of those too. We
could probably curate a slide deck so that it references each of the different electoral areas. So rather than having 7 of them, a whole bunch more. Yeah. So yeah, I think that would be a really good idea for sure.
Yeah, in fact, I'll write that down.
Just a quick follow-up question. I'm not sure if Tim has any questions, but you had listed off a number of parks, and certainly when I look at your slides with a lot of the blacked out area of private property, they're still heavily treed private property. Some of them are actual zoned AG1 or cut blocks or for forestry. And so the slides really show that, I think you mentioned it, there's not a lot of large contiguous parks other than the Englishman River Park. And so you had started to list off Lee Road Community Park, potentially Huckleberry Lane Park. You had a bit of a short list that Lee Road Trail you were mentioning. Those would be good candidates for potentially community cleanup preparedness events. Will the reports for the areas go into that level of detail from your assessment, or is that more of a map overview of how you're looking at the risk assessment for G?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the plans themselves are fairly strategic and high level. So, you know, obviously the recommendations reflect the risk that has been done during the risk analysis. And to make the plans more meaningful to people, we will try to reference specific areas where we see need for different activities. But to give the regional district flexibility and also to align with the interest of different communities and community support, frankly, in some of these initiatives, it'll be left more open-ended as to where some of these activities occur. But I mentioned those just to sort of
great, thanks. And I didn't have any further.
Okay. Thanks, Leanne. Am I frozen or are you, Leanne? I'm not sure.
It's a really important topic. And last summer with the heat dome, there were quite a few really stressed out residents in Area G. Dashwood did a whole bunch of work with their coordinator at that end of Area G, but this end of Area G, there wasn't a lot of people understanding what they could do themselves. And so the map picture that shows for the presentation that shows the different spacing of interface zones to clear properties. I'm assuming that information will be readily available to residents as well.
Yeah, so we do cover sort of the basics of FireSmart in the CWRP itself, but the best resource for that kind of information about how to actually go about landscaping your property and what sort of things you should be thinking about are definitely the FireSmart publications themselves, which will be strongly referenced in the document and also will be a feature of the recommendations. So going forward from the CWRP, making sure that those FireSmart materials are there's high awareness of them among residents at large in the electoral area is an important part of the plan. And sort of getting those materials into the hands of residents will be a major consideration of the education component of the plan.
And for now, the information links to all the different FireSmart pages, because there's FireSmart BC and then there's also FireSmart Canada, as well as a number of other resources like BC Wildfire. They're all on that Get Involved Wildfire Resiliency page right now.
Yep.
So if you have people asking for that information, it is kind of collected right there. If they want just a FireSmart link, I would recommend FireSmart BC. It's probably the most streamlined and most organized place to look for what a resident can do individually.
And compared to some of the FireSmart Canada stuff, I know FireSmart BC has also updated their material more recently. So I think their most recent homeowner guide was rewritten last year, I believe. So their stuff is just a bit more up to date at the moment. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And yes, if Tim had any questions, he actually lives quite close to me. So we have similar concerns about living in a moderate fire interface zone.
Yes. Yeah, we're happy to take any questions.
Maybe you could share just a couple of questions that other workshops have asked. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but because it's such a small group, and I think that will be shared. And what are the most prevalent questions that you're receiving as part of these presentations?
Yeah, I can off the top, the one that I think a lot of people have asked basically like, how do I FireSmart my property? So people are sort of turning to the plan to get a bit more information about sort of what resources are available, which is good because it means that there's sort of a demand out there for some of the education piece that the plan is able to talk about. I'd say people are also interested in sort of what the meaning of the threat and risk rankings are. So when we present to them, often people will have questions sort of about, what the difference between a moderate and a high is. And so I tried to sort of include information in the presentation I've just given you that helps sort of answer that question. And yeah, people are also looking for who to ask about specific issues that are of concern in their property or in their neighborhood. So often people are sort of looking for, who do I talk to about X? And I don't know, Caitlin, if you have further thoughts about some questions that we've received.
I think another one is that we've kind of received is, how do we pay for some of these these kind of recommendations? And so, obviously we want the taxpayers' money to go to good use and be most optimized. So one of the things that we do have an opportunity to tap into is a provincial grant through the community or the Union of British Columbia Municipalities. It's called the Community Resiliency Investment Program. And it's the funding body for a lot of wildfire resiliency programs in local government, like the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan that we're designing now. So we've made applications in the last several years to the UBCM, and we've been successful in receiving a significant amount of grant money each year for approved activities. And those activities must fall within those 7 FireSmart disciplines. And so a couple of examples are things that Matt already listed in his presentation. So some of those, changing bylaws or hiring a FireSmart coordinator. But some of the bigger ticket items like actually conducting a fuel management project, that can also potentially be funded through the CRI program, as well as doing fuel management prescriptions. And on the other end of the spectrum, we can also apply to them for funding to buy more FireSmart materials so that someone like myself can distribute them during public engagement activities. So I think that was another question that has popped in and out throughout the program process. I think the other one that came up in my mind is a lot of people ask about kind of one way in, one way out communities, as well as response capacities of the local response jurisdictions. And so, Matt, if you wanted to comment on that one, kind of how does the community wildfire resiliency plan look at our local firefighting resources and their ability to access certain areas?
Yeah, so that's a piece of the plan, as well, as Caitlin mentions, that I don't spend as much time talking about during these presentations, because we really want to get across sort of the risk analysis. But Caitlin's right to mention it. It is an important part of the final document. So we've had conversations with the local firefighters in each of the electoral areas, to understand what their resources are for both fighting a fire and what kinds of equipment they have on hand that's suited to the task. And then we also have been hearing from them where their areas of concern are. So we take some of that information qualitatively and address it in the plan. And while a lot of sort of the interview information doesn't get directly reflected in the wildfire risk that you see on the maps, it does absolutely inform the recommendations that come out of the plan in terms of which areas are considered maybe higher priority for different actions. So Caitlin was mentioning access. So if a neighborhood, if a fire department has sort of clued us into a neighborhood, and we are aware that the neighborhood only has one public access road, then we might sort of start thinking about opportunities to reduce wildfire risk around that area, in preference over an area that has multiple accesses or is closer to the core fire service area, for example. So a lot of that kind of information will be in the plan as sort of an inventory, and it ends up getting reflected in the risk profile of your community in terms of what areas are targeted in the recommendations.
That's interesting. Yeah. And if I could just clarify, you did have a slide and you listed Dashwood, San Periel, River's Edge.
Yeah.
You had just had some interface areas listed. So is that what the plan will do, is focus on those sort of village names of those areas? Because there's not really a clear boundary.
Yeah. Again, so the plan, the area of interest of the plan is the entire electoral area. And then within that area, we start cutting down when we talk about the wildland urban interface. So the risk results are only done within the wildland urban interface. And the sort of these the funding program, that provincial money that Caitlin's been talking about, that we're able to get sort of continuing grants for these activities through, the activities can generally only, the ones that are spatially specific, can only be within that wildland urban interface also. So the recommendations will sort of address all of these things and try to synthesize them in a way that makes sense to the way that people already think about their community. And so to that end, we try to use the names that people are familiar with. But we're really thinking about the modeled risk and the information that we get from locals like the firefighters. When we talk about those recommendations, we're not trying to target or define, like a very specific area to sort of limit ourselves. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
I can follow up a little bit too on
Yeah.
that one.
So,
So,
do you want to try to ungarble my thought there?
yeah, totally. And that's another question that we get is a lot of times people see that private land and they're like, or like the public land, and they're these tiny little pieces on a map covered in black. And we just want to, you know, we don't want to give the impression that we're not looking at the whole area and that we're not considering what the risks and so on and so forth would be. All that we're able to do, all that map means is that we're only allowed to present threat data on public land. And so the recommendations that we make that are spatially specific. So for example, Matt might recommend that we do a fuel treatment in an area. He can only recommend that we do a fuel treatment on RDN property. And so those are the spatial specific ones, but the plan does look at, you know, what are the critical infrastructure and are they near wooded areas? Or, you know, is there a chunk of like those one way in, one way out communities that, you know, we should be sending them a lot more of our FireSmart material, and we should be focusing our FireSmart community programs on those areas. And so in some cases, they might be more specific than just those mapped out areas that you saw. But when we are actually in emergency services able to digest the plan and take it in, we will be able to then target smaller communities and break it down that way.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. I understand. So you're using a set of criteria, and that includes entrance, egress, fire service, interface, location, proximity to public land. So there's an actual set of criteria that you're using, and then using just common labels for each of the community areas, which comprise G. Got it. Thank you.
And of course, as always, I like to just lay out a plug. If anybody has any more questions, or if you have a question that you'd like to ask publicly, give us a holler on that Get Involved page and I can answer them publicly. So even if it's a question that's you're particularly keen on the public knowing about, I can answer it publicly, and that way people can see some of those frequently asked questions. We haven't had a lot of we've had a lot of people looking at our webpage, but we haven't had a lot of people engaging in our webpage. So I always like to give that one a plug. You know, if you have any questions, shoot it there. But if you want to ask privately as well, or you just want some more clarification on something specific, or if you have another resident coming up to you saying, hey, I don't get this, can you send me to a person? Feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. I'm always happy to chat with people and bother Matt if it's a question that I don't know.
Understood. That's great. I didn't have any further questions for you this evening, and I just wanted to thank you both. It was a very interesting presentation. Sorry it was such a small group. So.
Oh, well, thank you for coming, Leanne. And
thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tim.
Okay, you're welcome.
Did I accidentally? Whoop.
Okay, well, Caitlin, I guess that is our event for the night. So again, thank you both for coming. And yeah, head over to the Get Involved page if you want any more information or get in touch with Caitlin or me. Yeah, so thanks for coming out, and stay tuned for that future event about the plan summaries coming to a online Zoom meeting near you.
Thank you.